In March 2025, British Columbia shocked North America with a bold and unexpected move that sent ripples through the continent's political and economic landscape. The province announced plans to impose new tolls on all commercial trucks heading north to Alaska, a decision that immediately grabbed headlines and sparked heated debate. This was no idle threat. It was a direct response to escalating U.S. trade aggression, particularly the latest round of tariffs and restrictions coming from Washington. Premier David Eby called it a defensive measure, making it clear that BC wouldn't sit quietly as the Trump administration ramped up economic pressure on Canadian industries and workers. The tolls specifically targeted the Alaska Highway, a 390-mile lifeline for goods moving from the lower 48 to Alaska, and a critical artery for both American and Canadian supply chains. Businesses and consumers on both sides of the border immediately worried. Higher costs, supply chain disruptions, and a new front in the Canada-US trade war seemed inevitable. For many, the uncertainty was just as damaging as the tolls themselves. Eby made it clear, this was leverage, not just revenue. The tolls were designed to force Washington to the negotiating table, not simply to fill provincial coffers. If the US didn't back down on tariffs, BC would make them feel the pain in a very real and immediate way, hitting American businesses where it hurt most. The focus was on commercial trucking, everything from groceries and food supplies to industrial parts, machinery and building materials that Alaska depends on for daily life and economic growth. The message was unmistakable. Canada could use its geography as a powerful bargaining chip, not just a vulnerability to be exploited by others. The move was national in scope, with implications for Canadian sovereignty, the future of cross-border trade, and the delicate balance of power between the two countries. The world watched as BC drew a line in the snow, threatening to halt the era of free passage, at least for now. The stakes had never been higher for both sides. This wasn't just about trucks. It was about economic independence, national pride, and sending a clear message to Washington that Canada would not be pushed around. The tolls were a warning shot, not just for Alaska, but for the entire US-Canada relationship, signaling a new era of assertiveness from British Columbia. British Columbia was ready to absorb some pain to make a point. Economic warfare cuts both ways, and this time Canada was prepared to fight back. The spark? President Trump's March 2025 announcement of sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. The move stunned Canadian industries already struggling post-pandemic, and Trump's rhetoric, hinting at military action and even annexation, fueled outrage. Premier Eby accused Trump of wanting to make Canada the 51st state, echoing a national sense of indignation. The US wasn't seeking fair trade, Canadians felt, it was bullying. Trump briefly paused the tariffs for a month and expanded exemptions, but the damage was done. Trust was shattered, and provinces like BC began plotting their own countermeasures. The stage was set for a full-blown economic standoff. BC didn't just talk, they acted. When faced with mounting trade tensions, the province moved swiftly, determined to protect its economy and send a message that it would not be caught off guard. On March 14, 2025, the government introduced the Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act. This was a direct response to the threat of US tariffs, and it was designed to give BC new tools to defend its interests. This law gave BC the power to slap tolls on US trucks heading to Alaska if tariffs persisted. It was a bold move, targeting a vital supply route and signaling that BC was ready to fight back if necessary. The act was conditional, a tool to be used only if the US escalated. It wasn't automatic, but it made clear that BC had options on the table and was prepared to use them if pushed. Deputy Premier Nikki Sharma called it a shield, not a sword. BC didn't want tolls but needed leverage. The province hoped for de-escalation, but made it clear it would defend itself if forced. The law had a sunset clause expiring in May 2027, underscoring its temporary crisis-driven nature. This wasn't about permanent barriers, but about having a measured, time-limited response ready. The bill's scope was broad, potentially covering other routes and even ferries, not just the Alaska Highway. Any path US goods might take through BC could be affected if the situation escalated. The message: BC was ready for a multi-pronged response if needed. The government wanted to show it was thinking ahead, not just reacting. The act was expected to pass quickly, showing the government's resolve. Lawmakers from across the province recognized the urgency and the need for a united front. The focus remained on Alaska-bound commerce, but the province was arming itself for a wider economic fight. BC was making it clear that it would not be an easy target in any trade dispute. This was about protecting BC's interests and sending a clear warning to Washington. The province was determined to stand up for its people and its economy, no matter the challenge. The legislation was both a deterrent and a declaration. BC would not be pushed around. In the face of uncertainty, the province chose action over hesitation, making its position unmistakably clear. Ottawa didn't sit idle. As the news of US tariffs rippled across the country, the Canadian government quickly mobilized its response. Prime Minister Trudeau called Trump's tariffs a very dumb thing to do and hit back with retaliatory tariffs of his own, sending a clear message that Canada would not back down. The federal strategy was simple but forceful. Match US tariffs dollar for dollar, target key American industries, and make it clear that Canada could play hardball too. At the same time, Ottawa pushed for a return to tariff-free trade, hoping to restore the economic partnership that had benefited both nations for decades. Trudeau's government also aimed to pressure US states to lobby against Trump's policies, leveraging the deep economic ties between Canadian provinces and American states. At home, the crisis sparked a renewed push to remove internal Canadian trade barriers, making the domestic market more resilient and less vulnerable to outside shocks. Premier Eby echoed this, urging provinces to work together and strengthen Canada from within. He called for unity and efficiency within Canada, emphasizing that internal cooperation was just as important as external resistance. The external threat brought provinces and Ottawa together, forging a sense of common purpose rarely seen in Canadian politics. For once, political differences were set aside, presenting a rare united front to the world. BC's toll threat and Ottawa's tariffs were not isolated moves, but coordinated steps in a larger, carefully crafted strategy. The message to Washington was unmistakable. Canada was united, determined, and prepared to defend its interests on every front. The country's leaders stood firm, showing that Canada would not be intimidated. The hope was that this show of resolve and solidarity would force the US back to the negotiating table. The stakes were high, but so was Canadian resolve. Across the country, workers, businesses, and politicians braced for a long fight, united in their determination. Canada was signaling it would not be bullied by tariffs or by threats. The nation was ready to stand its ground no matter the cost. The fallout spread fast. Yukon, sharing a border with Alaska, mirrored BC's tough stance. Premier Ranch Pillai ordered Yukon liquor stores to stop buying American alcohol and restricted US firms from government contracts. Yukon faced logistical hurdles, no toll stations yet, but the intent was clear: economic pushback. In Ontario, Premier Doug Ford announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the US, targeting American consumers directly. The message retaliation wasn't just a Western issue. Canada's biggest provinces were on board. Yukon residents even floated symbolic bans, like excluding Alaskan athletes from the Arctic Winter Games. The public wanted action, not just words. Across Canada, frustration with US tactics was boiling over. The trade dispute was now a national fight, with provinces large and small joining the fray. Alaska sounded the alarm. State Senator Robert Myers, a trucker himself, warned that tolls would spike prices for everything from groceries to oil field parts. Alaska's unique geography means it relies on BC's highways for critical, time-sensitive goods. The Alaska Trucking Association predicted higher costs and supply chain chaos. Governor Mike Dunleavy urged federal dialogue, hoping to avoid Alaska becoming collateral damage in a bigger trade war. Alaskan businesses braced for hardship, caught between Ottawa and Washington. The anxiety was real. Alaska was vulnerable, and the toll threat was a direct hit. The state called for de-escalation, but the threat loomed large. The dispute quickly spilled into tourism. Under US law, Alaska-bound cruise ships must stop in a foreign port, usually BC. This gave BC leverage, but also made it vulnerable. Alaska Senator Dan Sullivan threatened to seek a waiver of the Passenger Vessel Services Act, letting cruise ships bypass BC entirely. The precedent? A similar waiver during the COVID-19 pandemic. Losing cruise traffic would devastate BC's port cities, costing thousands of jobs and millions in revenue. Nearly 2 million cruise passengers were expected in 2025, all required to stop in BC. The threat of a waiver turned the dispute into a high-stakes chess match. If BC squeezed Alaska's supply lines, Alaska could hit back at BC's tourism lifeline. The economic interdependence was clear, and so was the risk of mutual harm. The cruise ships became symbols of a much bigger, more dangerous trade conflict. The stakes had never been higher for both sides. Implementing tolls wasn't simple. BC and Yukon had no toll stations on the Alaska Highway. Building them would be costly and slow. Legal questions loomed. International agreements might protect the highway from tolls, opening the door to lawsuits. Even if legal toll collection would be complex, physical booths could cause delays, while electronic systems would require new tech. The Act's temporary nature raised doubts about investing in expensive infrastructure for a short-term measure. Some hoped the threat alone would be enough to force U.S. concessions. The practical and legal hurdles were real, but so was BC's determination. The province was betting that a credible threat could achieve its goals without ever collecting a dime. By June 2025, the standoff remained unresolved. BC's toll law was ready but not yet triggered. The U.S. tariff pause was expiring, and all eyes were on Washington and Ottawa. Would Trump double down, or would diplomacy prevail? For Canada, this was a test of economic sovereignty and unity. For Alaska, it exposed the risk of geographic isolation and cross-border dependence. Businesses on both sides braced for impact. Truckers, tourism operators, and consumers all caught in the crossfire. The uncertainty itself was damaging, chilling investment and planning. The North American economy, once seamless, now looked fragile and interconnected in dangerous ways. The outcome depended on political will and a return to dialogue. The livelihoods of thousands hung in the balance, waiting for leaders to step back from the brink.